Welcome to the League of Extraordinary Storytellers, the podcast that takes you inside the dynamic world of themed experience design. I'm your host, Theron Skees. In each episode, I sit down with industry experts to explore how their teamwork and collaboration transform ideas into unforgettable destinations. I hope it inspires you to see the world through a brand new lens, one story at a time. Join us as we celebrate the visionaries who make the impossible possible. Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of the League of Extraordinary Storytellers. I'm so excited to have you back with us. I realize now, as I'm recording this, that this episode will drop in the middle of May 15th. And what's really magical about that date is that's the date that my publisher says that my book is distributing. So there's a really kind of cool synchronicity happening there. So we'll see if we can line that up. But thanks for joining me again. You know, this is the podcast where we really start talking to all of these different disciplines within the themed entertainment industry. And the goal here is for you, the viewer, the listener, to really get an idea of what it's like for these dynamic teams to communicate. I have so many different disciplines. How do they work together at the end of the day and build these incredible, sometimes miraculous venues and experiences? Today, I have a special treat because I have a super creative person with me today. In previous episodes, I've tried to balance with team members that have a very different expertise than me. And today I'm joined by Joe Lanzisero, who is a friend and a colleague, and actually a former leader of mine from Walt Disney Imagineering. Joe, thanks so much for joining, and welcome to the League.
Oh, wow. It's an honor, a pleasure to be here and be able to talk with you again. And yes, we were colleagues back at Imagineering and did some amazing things together. You know, those were great times. We were chatting earlier about, the times that we got to, do really extraordinary things together. And so it's great to be able to share again with you, spend some time talking about those things and passing on some of the great things we learned.
Absolutely. I love this idea that it was this, probably every generation of Imagineers feels this way, but it was just such a golden age of expansion. And there were so many different things that we were so blessed to be able to do. And so I count that as a real amazing part of my professional career. And of course, getting to work with amazing people like you. I mean, amazing.
I feel this. I said this. The smartest thing I did was to surround myself with people that were more talented and smarter than myself. I always stood on the shoulders of giants, and I think, that's what makes a successful project, having a really great team, a like-minded team, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit because I think it's a part of developing the big ideas, getting the right dynamic of people together. But I got to say, I always felt like I was learning, and mostly learning from the people around me. I think one of the greatest things about Imagineering was the diversity of thought that took place there, because people came from all different kinds of backgrounds. As you were talking earlier, and you've had different disciplines, people from different disciplines talking on your show, but for me, it was great to sit and talk with an architect, sit and talk with the sculpture, sit and talk with an engineer, and everybody brought a little different perspective to things, but collectively, that's what made it so great.
I totally agree. That interplay, you felt like a conductor almost, that you were, moving these uber talented people to create this synergistic symphony in a sense. So I just love that. Well, I mean, you were with Imagineering quite a bit longer than I was, and got to do some amazing things, really contributing to some of the most well-known and iconic experiences in the world. Could you just take a second for maybe any listeners that might not have been born yet and may not know of you? Could you just talk a little bit about what you did?
Okay, well, quickly. I'm going to go way back, because I think what really formed my experience was my school years, and particularly at CalArts. I was very, very fortunate. And at the time, I didn't realize that I was in the first graduating class of the character animation program. And some of my fellow students were people like John Lasseter, who went on to create Pixar, John Musker, who went on to write Little Mermaid and Moana and other great classic features. Anyway, that was Tim Burton. He and I actually were carpooled back and forth to school together. So, but we were just a bunch of kids who, loved Disney. We loved storytelling. We all loved to draw. And I almost felt like we were learning as much from each other again, as we did from the great professors we had. And most of the teachers there were from Disney. Some of them were the 9 old men that worked directly with Walt. So very, very fortunate to have that experience and to be hired immediately after that as a Disney animator. I was an animator for about 8 years in feature animation when, through a series of circumstances, I chose to move over to Imagineering. And honestly, I never looked back. It was the best decision because I just got so many great opportunities. Not long after moving to Imagineering, I got the opportunity to create the first whole new land at Disneyland, Mickey's Toontown. And then we went and we replicated that in Tokyo. And that actually started a long relationship with my association with the Asian parks. First, I worked on a number of projects in Tokyo Disneyland, and then became the creative executive over all of Tokyo. Then became the creative executive over all of Hong Kong, and that's where you and I worked together. You were
That's right.
the in-park art director in charge of all the design for the park. And that was a great experience. So much fun working with you. It was always fun. I mean, I look back, man, I just had so many, it's really the journey and not the destination. I think back, we did great things, but we always had fun doing those great things.
Right.
I was,
Absolutely.
and then I got the opportunity to lead the design for at that time, the first 2 major large class Disney cruise ships, the Dream and the Fantasy, which again, you took over and carried that forward after I left Disney. So yeah, I had a lot of great opportunities. It was a really good run. I was fortunate, like I said, I would say 80 or 90% of most of the things we brainstormed ended up, being built. So
That's a great record.
yeah, it was, but again, like I said, I stood on the shoulders of giants, always had great teams, always had great people to work with, and tried to have fun along the way.
Absolutely. What impresses me, and I'm sure this wasn't lost on some of our audience members, is that your career journey tracked the original Imagineers that Walt found, right, from the studio, from animation, from live action, and literally moved them from that 2D world into the 3D world of the parks. I think that's so. I think that's so cool. My next question is really about, early in your career. I'm just wondering what that first project, that first moment where you realized the application of your skill in sort of that 3D world, where you kind of stood back and saw this dimensional physical thing that you've made. Do you recall a moment where you
Oh,
had that?
oh yeah, very much so. And it was Mickey's Toontown. I was fortunate that when I moved over to Imagineering, there were lots of opportunities. It was the beginning. It was when Michael Eisner and Frank Wells came on, and they were starting the Disney Decade, and it was a boom. I mean, they were very, very ambitious and wanted to really, really build the theme park industry. I mean, adding new parks. They were the ones that started the cruise line, adding new attractions, new lands, and so I was just a kid. I was only 34 years old at the time, and I didn't realize how profound it was at the moment when I'm given the opportunity to create a new land at Disneyland. Now, I grew up in Southern California. I grew up as a kid going to Disneyland. So imagine the thrill to think that now I get to touch this park that Walt created and add to the legacy. And I felt like I didn't realize at the time. I was a little nervous, but I did feel like I had the skills because, especially with that project, it was really a 3-dimensional realization of the animation world, which I spent, so many years studying, both the
Right.
CalArts and then applying it in animation. So looking back, I think, I was the right choice to do that. Not to sound egotistical, because I was able to bring that to the project. But then it was also huge learning for me, because I was from a 2D world. Now we're going to the 3D world. But that's what was great about Imagineering. You had all these safety nets. I had all these incredible people, like, John Olson, Skip Lang, Ron Esposito. These were the people, that knew the technical side of it, like yourself, that knew how to make a drawing into a thing, a real thing that people are going to touch and walk through. Um, so that was that moment for me. When in fact, I think it was on a preview day. And you know how when you're in these projects, you're going, your
Right.
head down, and you're just, and
Exactly.
I had a chance to stop and just go, oh my gosh, look what we got to do. Look what I got to do, and
Yeah.
it
This
was
is really fun.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome. I was thinking one of the primary ways that you contributed to the book was informing, how do you form the big idea? How do you generate the big idea? And I'm struck now with a little bit different perspective, because you came from the world of animation and into the world of themed entertainment, themed experience design. I'm just curious about how your experience in animation formed your process of blue sky, of concept ideation. How did that, how do you generate ideas, and how was it informed by that?
Well, you just said the right ideas. Everything comes down to an idea, a concept. Whether, in animation, I'm doing a scene, and I have to think about what is the core idea that I'm trying to communicate. What is this, this character thinking? What is this character feeling? How does this moment in this animated scene connect to the scene before it? It's going to connect to the scene after it, and then how is it going to further the big idea? So in essence, I always had to think about the big idea. Even when you're doing projects, the projects are they're made up of so much minutia. All, especially, any themed entertainment project, they're so complicated. There's so many hands that touch them. So for me, having learned back in those formative years that it's the idea that becomes the glue that holds it all together. And if that idea is strong enough and has been vetted and has been and is focused, then everything that follows, you always have something to go back to check. Is this right? Are we still on track? Are we still being true to this core idea? So that's been I think that was the thread through my entire career, was always remembering back that it all starts with an idea, and make sure that idea is solid, and make sure that idea is going to be able to pass the test of so many hands touching it. Because in animation, it was a very different process, but it still had to go through a lot of different hands, just
Right.
like in Imagineering. You knew after you had that initial blue sky session, then okay, now the real work started of having to design it, and then making sure the design stayed true to that initial big idea.
Fantastic. I love the fact that, when you're working in film, obviously it's all about representing a story. It's a progression of scenes. It's the theme of the story, that drives the characters, and it's so amazing to see that represented in the way, especially Imagineering, but I think throughout the industry, in one degree or another, people are focusing on story
Yeah.
as the North Star, and all those ideas are,
Mhm.
lining up with that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I always talked that there was two kinds of. I don't want to get off subject too much, but
Oh no, this is
you
great.
meant no, you meant, because you meant, story was all. I mean, what I was doing with the big idea in animation was always about being true to the story. Um, and in animation, story was narrative. There was a script, there was storyboards, and then you were following that. I guess what I learned when I moved to the 3D world of Imagineering is that there were two types of story. there was story as narrative, and there was story as subtext. Story as narrative was kind of a continuation of what I had learned in animation, and that was, mostly when you were interpreting an established IP. If you're doing an attraction based on Toy Story, you're doing an attraction based on Mickey Mouse and the characters. They have established stories. So then your job, as you're brainstorming and translating it into a project, is to make sure you're hitting all those key emotional touch points that people remembered from the story, because it had to resonate emotionally, and you had the best,
Right.
and you were half the work was done for you because people had seen the movie, they heard the songs, they were already in love with it. But then there's projects where you had to create subtext, where the story piece of it was more for informing the design process, where you had for like on the cruise ships. I think that's a good example, because a lot of that wasn't so much about, people were going to go through a ride and get a beginning, middle, and end. There were venues based on, you know, maybe based on candy store, based on Wreck-It Ralph or whatever. So then you create a backstory, for the designers, and they use that as a way to, again, check their ideas and to keep everybody like you. I think you used the term, you were the conductor earlier, and the conductor has a musical score. So that score,
Right.
everybody agrees we're going to work off that score. So the subtext story becomes that score that everybody works off of. But anyway,
That's fantastic. I
I
love
yeah.
that. When your contribution to creating memorable worlds, one of the things that resonated so deeply with me, and it was like, you sent it to me and I'm writing and I'm reading what you're saying and including it. And I just gave this collective yes, because it just resonated. And that was about, you said that you need structure and discipline, and
Yeah.
that those are essential to successful blue sky sessions. And the reason that I'm like high fiving you in midair, pretending you're here is, is that, after talking to some students, of the next generation, a lot of them kind of feel like, you sit around Hawaiian shirts, you play with Play-Doh, and you dream up, great things. Though that may be true, but it kind of suggests that there's no boundaries and no rules. And I'd love for you to lean in a little bit onto how that's both wrong and right at the same time. You
Yeah,
need structure.
that's key. Wrong and right. Um, I prefer to play within an established box. People say, "Oh, you got to think outside the box." So the challenge was always to create a box, know what the parameters were, and in some ways that was liberating, because you knew then what you should and shouldn't do. So I always like to, in the blue sky sessions, do a couple things. First, um, prior to the actual blue sky session, giving a slight brief, or sending out a brief the day or a few days before everybody was going to get together, with just enough information to get them thinking about it. But also the sneaky part of that too was to tell them, let's not get too far off of this basic idea. And then the second thing we would do is design. We would create design filters, and the design filters are, what are we solving for? What is it that we're trying to create here? And who are we? So there's a whole kind of a whole list of things that you have to put together. And often we would work with the park operators. We would work in post Disney. When you're working with clients, you have money people. So there's money parameters. There's site parameters. Where's this thing going to go on the site? You have to be smart about all of that and understand that this is going to be a practical thing that's going to live in the world, and it's going to have to, satisfy a business model. It's going to have to operate. You're going to have to move people through it, and you don't want to get bogged down in all of that. And if you overthink that, it can it can stifle the creativity, but you have to know that it's all there, you know? And so creating these design filters, it just as checkpoints. And actually we make a physical board, you know, and say like when we were doing the expansion for Hong Kong Disneyland.
I remember.
And we knew, you know, the park was too small, so we had to make the park bigger. We also knew that in that culture, they were a counting culture. You know, and there's a reason why when you go into a Chinese restaurant, you get so many choices because they like to have a lot of choice. So I remember one of the executives was saying, you know, we have to count everything. The competition park was Ocean Park across the way in Hong Kong. I remember looking at their map, and they would count like restrooms and drinking fountains as things to do. I know, maybe it was not that extreme, but we had to think that way. So we had to create this board, you know, and then it had to work for multi languages. You know, we knew we wanted to exploit Disney IP, so we had all those filters. These were the things that we need to solve for. So then when people come into the room to start to brainstorm, they know, okay, I have a brief story idea. I know these are the things that, you know, we're going to try to solve for. But then the important thing, I think our job, your job, my job as leaders when you're in the room is to create an atmosphere of openness. You know, not, and if people get too bogged down on those things, again, I'm going to go back to your analogy of the conductor. You know, just like a conductor, you know, if somebody they need to understand if they're like overplaying a note or something, you just got to pull them back and say, no, you know, you can lighten up. You don't have to be so bogged down by, you know, the constraints. And just creating an atmosphere, I think the most important thing of there's no bad ideas, you know,
That's
and
right.
that everybody feels, and that's very empowering, you know, because people should not be afraid to, you know, be stupid. That's what I was like. Oh no, I don't think that's. I don't want to say it. I go, no, say it. I want to hear it. I don't
That's
care.
right.
You're not. No one's. There's no judgment here.
And
So
it might inspire multiple other ideas. I always thought that was really cool.
yeah,
Somebody might say something and they'll preface it, or they're
yeah,
self-edit, right? Oh,
yeah,
this might be stupid, but, and then somebody will get inspired and you end up with a really cool direction.
yeah. And that's it exactly, Theron. In fact, the best brainstorm sessions is when one idea builds on the next, and that comes out of people feeling open. They throw an idea out, and then somebody goes, "Oh, that's cool, but what if we did this with that?" Um, the other thing is trying not to let there be too much of a sense of ownership. Not, we all a single owner, and that was the other thing I would try to do is that we are all doing this together. You know, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier about the process. You know, the building these themed entertainment, you know, extravaganzas takes so many different kinds of people, and there is no real authorship. You know, there's leaders and there's people that might, you know, that have to be kind of in a driver's seat at some point, but ultimately it's everybody working together and making sure they understand their part in the bigger whole, feel empowered to do the best they can, not to feel marginalized in any way. You know, that no matter what your role is, it's important. If it's, you know, if you're the guy that's just, you know, just painting the railing, whatever, coming up with the colors for it, you know what? Without those, it's not going to be complete. So everybody brings something important to the process.
I think that ecosystem is so important to understand because it if done right, it should, as you've described, feed off of each other and benefit each other. Right? That's a true synergy. Yeah, I like this idea, and I've seen it happen so many times where maybe it's a leader would come in with a vision. I have a vision for this,
Yeah.
but the vision is just that. It's a starting point. It's not even a North Star yet. And it takes the whole team to input on that vision. And you know, our projects take what, 3, 5, 10 years
Yeah.
sometimes, depending on size and complexity. And those initial visions and ideas can change a lot with everybody's input.
Yeah.
And I always like to think that the vision is, or the idea is even better after it goes through all
Yes.
of the different contributions by everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. What the ultimately, in fact, this goes back to a lesson we learned, and actually it was Walt who, and I learned this through the gentleman that worked with Walt, this idea of plussing. And it's different where everything that came to you as part of the process, he encouraged them to try to plus it. Now that's not changing it. There's a difference, if you get an idea and you want to make it bigger or different. Now his thing was, let's always the you took your storyboard drawing, and then the storyboard drawing, how can I plus that? How can I make that idea stronger? How can I make it clearer? And that's plussing. And I think I saw that same thing when I moved then to Imagineering, that each of the disciplines, if they knew, and again, I think it goes back to, if the core story, the core big idea was strong, you know, and then as a leader, I also had to learn to let go a little bit too, because like you said, you often come in with a vision, and I learned that sometimes somebody could have, if it was different, it didn't necessarily mean that my idea was better. Different is good,
Right,
as
right.
long as it worked within the framework of furthering the big idea, and not deviating too far from the big idea.
Yeah, so important.
Yeah,
I want to go back to something that you said, just to highlight it a little bit, is the fact that the work that we do is commercial in nature,
yeah,
right? It's design. It leverages art, but you wouldn't categorize it as art, because it's design is meant to solve problems, grow brand, grow audiences,
yeah.
make money. And people in the industry shouldn't feel guilty about that.
No,
We leverage art, we leverage story, we leverage all these different artistic things to bring about a creation, an experience that's wholly unique. One thing that I really like, and I'd just love to get your reaction on this, is that of all the design disciplines in the world, I think of, like, product design, industrial design, etc. Very, very few. In fact, I think maybe just ours is the only design discipline where one of the design requirements is that what we create has to make an emotional connection with the user.
yeah.
If you're designing refrigerators, that's not a design requirement. And I think that really changes our approach to what we create.
Yeah. Um, over the since leaving Disney, I've gotten involved in the world of UX, of user experience, um, and it was funny because my introduction into that world, I was invited to be a speaker at a conference, and I remember talking to the organizer, and I said, "Well, I'm really flattered that you're inviting me." I said, "But can I ask a question?" I go, "What's UX?" And he kind of laughed. He goes, it's what you've been doing your entire career. He said, you're creating user experiences. And what he saw, and I have to thank him, this is a gentleman's by the name of Hannes, in Austria. And I think what he does with his conferences and why they're different, it's human-centered design, because the difference between, and you just mentioned it, making a refrigerator, but you can make a refrigerator better if you think about the user, and in a crazy way add story to it, something that's going to give it emotional resonance. And that's what we learned at Disney, so it's kind of great. And I know you're doing it now post Disney, I'm doing it now post Disney. We're working with a lot of different clients, but we kind of have the secret sauce. We
Right.
know, we learn that that's the thing that changes the user experience from, just being mechanical to being emotional, of creating something where people want to do it again. They want to tell their friends about it. They have a deeper connection to the experience because of that. And that's because of all those tricks that we learned at Disney.
It's so true. It's so true. I mean, COVID was the time where like thousands and millions of people did, is, you just find yourself at home. And I got to think through all of those things. And some of the hard questions that I asked myself was, is what I learned and what I've practiced professionally in all these years, is it valuable outside of the world of themed entertainment? Am I just the attraction guy, or does it have meaning? And I think times like that in our careers are really important to step out and to really ask ourselves that. And as you said, I can't believe it. It's year 5 for me on my own outside of Disney, and it turns out that there are almost every segment of the global economy can really benefit from the principles that you and I used every single day.
Yeah,
Not just storytelling, but the fact that, especially if you're building a destination, a place,
right.
the only way that that is successful is if people come back over and over again, right?
Right. And what's gonna bring them back? That emotional connection, that thing that they either they can see themselves in some. It's the human aspect of it. That's why
Mm.
it's UX group would call it, human centered design. Where you're thinking about the whole human experience. How am I going to? And again, these are all things that we learn. How because we have to create spaces that work for human beings to interact with. That means they have to interact on a physical level. you know is it
Yeah,
bright enough? Is the light bright enough? Is the graphics, do they communicate clearly? How am I going to interact with this experience? Where am I supposed to go? Do I turn right? Do I turn left? So those are all the practical things, that as a human being moving through a space you have to consider. But then the more, I think, equally or more important is, how do they connect with it emotionally? And that's why, Disney's story, I said, the story becomes the emotional glue. That's the thing, you know, uh, happy, sad, adventurous, understanding, the dynamic of story, how do you put tension to an experience,
yeah,
where there's, something that feels like it's going to happen, and then it doesn't happen. The famous Disney, something went terribly wrong, but they're cliches and they're devices, but they work because they contribute to that emotional experience. It's something that makes you, lifts you above the everyday, the ordinary, and makes you feel, and reminds you that you're alive.
definitely. So amazing. I love the description of human centered design. It's such a great
Yeah,
description of what we do, and it also reminds me that it's not just the outward focus, that we are focused on, what we're creating. We're creating for humans, but we're also. It occurs to me that it takes humans to create for humans. So in human centered design, you're also focused on the humans on your team, right? The people that you are around, that you not just lead, but that you influence every day. And one of the things that you said in your contribution to the book was that great ideas come from anyone.
yeah,
And that really resonated with me, because I definitely saw that in my time. And I wonder if you could just share an example where maybe an unexpected contributor made some kind of major impact, either on the project or on you personally, in that blue sky development phase.
I had kind of a love hate relationship with the estimators, and there was one estimator in particular. But I soon learned, they were there. And when I learned that he had, and this goes back to passion for your work, and I think that was another thread that we experienced at Disney and outside Disney too. When you get into this industry, you usually get into it because you have a passion for it. And I realized that all these individuals had a passion for what they were doing. And even though I would be at odds sometimes with the numbers that he put out, that, because they could make or break a project. They could come in and say it's going to cost, 5X, and we only have 2X to spend. But I knew that he really cared about it, and he cared about the fact that he was at Disney. And so I learned, somebody told me, keep your enemy. It really wasn't an enemy, but keep him close to you. And I remember I invited him into a blue sky session, and I think I might have been one of the first to invite an estimator into a blue sky session. And And I think he was so grateful for it that, and I got to be honest, I was a little apprehensive. I was going, oh, is he going to say, oh, we can't do that, it's going to cost us?
Right.
But he got caught up in it. He got caught up in it, and he actually contributed ideas. So I think that, and that was a big lesson to me, and it was very liberating for me, for others. And then it sealed in my mind the fact that good ideas can come from anywhere, and good ideas that come from informed people are even better ideas. And all these people that came from these different disciplines, like bringing ride engineers in early on, you know.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't even think about the ride, the technicalities of a ride system, but the other benefit, bringing them in early on, and they feel a couple things. First off, they feel invested when somebody is in that first initial blue sky session and you invite them in. All of a sudden, they feel really invested in the project, and then they also then start to understand what you're trying to work towards, what you're trying to achieve with it. And they may have had an idea for one kind of way to think about the ride delivery system, or maybe it was an audio system or whatever, but because they were involved early on thinking about it, they were able to then readjust their thinking too, and maybe come back with something different and better than that they would have never thought of. At the same time, they were contributing to the bigger, ideation process as well. So there were multiple benefits in inviting these different disciplines into the early blue sky sessions.
Excellent. Yeah, I definitely feel strongly about that as well, and got side glances and raised eyebrows from other brothers and sisters in the creative realm when you invite folks who traditionally don't come,
Yeah,
but then almost always after the session, people are coming out and going, "Wow, that person, that was great. I'm so
yeah,
glad you invited them."
yeah.
It reminds me when we started the Triton class ships. It's the three new ships that are, two of them are out now, and they're working on the third. And it was such a brand new industry for me. I had never done nautical design, and I put together a whole blue sky program, and spoke with, at the time it was Carl Holtz, who was the president of,
Oh, I love Carl. Yeah, he's
great, right, incredible leader.
a incredible leader. Yes. And we can go on it all for many of the reasons and things that we're talking about here, because Carl was
Absolutely.
great about understanding everyone's value and making sure that he told you that, and that you knew that he understood the value that you brought to something.
Absolutely. What it kind of surprised me with the short story that I'm going to tell. So I asked basically our leadership for Imagineering, Bob Weiss, hey, look, I'd love to sail on other cruise lines, and let's benchmark. Let's see what's out there. Let's see what they're doing. So put it together. It was basically 8 sailings in every region of the world that Disney sailed in, and it was on all the contemporary cruises, so it matched the category, if you will, that Disney was in. Plus, we sailed on 2 luxury lines. Now, I'm sure all of our listeners are going to be like, "Oh, wow, that was a tough job."
No, no,
But one of the things that was really amazing that did, that ties into this story, is that I was talking to Carl about it, and he realized that the leaders, his leaders within the DCL organization, hadn't actually benchmarked in like over 10 years.
wow.
So he funded them to go too. So we went together collaboratively. So, you're with Ozair looking at food and restaurants, and you're with Jim looking at entertainment spaces. And that made the benchmarking so much more rich,
Right,
because they were seeing those advancements at the same time.
right. And listening to the other benefit, because when I was working on the cruise ship too, I quickly learned, and I'm sure you learned this, that to the guest, it's the total experience that matters. And the total experience was just the things you talked about. It was the food. It was the cabin. It was the cleanliness. It was all those things. It wasn't just the design that you and I were trying to impart on the ships. you had to realize that, wow, it was all those things again, how they all work together to create the total experience for the guests. We could have created the greatest looking ships, with the neatest stuff,
Right.
but if the operations part of it, the food part, if all those things weren't there operating too, so being with all those, like the people that you went out with, and I knew those guys, and they were great. So I'm sure you had a lot of fun, and I bet you gained weight too, because I know my experience on the cruise ship, I always ended up gaining a few pounds along the way because all the wonderful eating and drinking that we got to do. But
Totally.
yeah,
Amazing experiences. I think, walking every single space that we possibly could on a competitor's, if you will,
wow,
ship. I mean, we had laser rulers. We took thousands of photographs, and I was
wow,
up to midnight every night documenting every space. We did really detailed reports. So I was so grateful that I
wow,
worked with a company that supported that kind of deep learning, so that then as a leader I could then create, right? Because
wow.
we knew the playing field. So it was just wonderful. It's a little different than Blue Sky, but I wanted to go there because
Wait, no, what you're saying, I think it's kind of analogous. I mean, that was, you were creating the box and the design filters by understanding, with where the industry was at, so that you could use that not only as benchmark, but how can we do this better? How can we do
right.
this more differently? I mean, so you're still having to apply creative thinking, but the creative thinking is being guided by now your deeper understanding of what's out there. Just brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just take a trip back to our Blue Sky. One of the things that you had said that again resonated with me was about how important it is for the team, after the Blue Sky session, to really revisit and refine those ideas. Can you talk about that a little bit? What
I
changes you typically see as the ideas kind of progress?
Yeah, I think, it's often in a good blue sky session, there's a lot of hopefully there's a lot of enthusiasm, and sometimes I call it like horde mentality, where, people will get kind of locked into something, and maybe you go too far with it, but you don't want to stop the momentum, in the moment, because that's part of what makes a great blue sky session. So by giving the ideas a day to settle down and then coming back and revisiting them, and you're out of that moment of group excitement, and you're able to then again put up your design filters again and look at, oh god, wow, everybody loved that, that the thought of doing the big yellow turning thing with the blah blah blah, and then you look at, yeah, maybe we went a little too far with that, because you got caught up in the moment. And then also you can apply some of those practical realities of cost too the next day. When you look at it, go, everybody fell in love with doing that giant slide with the blah 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 thing on it, but we only have X amount of dollars, and as a good designer, you're always thinking about putting the money where it's going to bring you the most value.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
so those were the kinds of things, by letting the ideas settle and being able to look at them with less emotion and more practical eyes. Because I think a good blue sky session should have probably more emotion in it and more excitement. You know, that's trying to stay clear of all those realities. But then you have to acknowledge the realities, and by doing it a day later, when you can do it a little more clear eyed, is very, very important.
And that's such a great description. And my follow up question, it dovetails perfectly with that, is, you're talking about this horde mentality where sometimes you can get hyper focused on a particular idea because everybody's excited and
Sure.
passionate. How do you manage that? As you're leading a Blue Sky, and so I'd like to talk about that. How do you keep people focused on areas, but also know when to kind of pull back on the reins? So that's part A, and then part B is, how do you keep people engaged and then try to balance between maybe some of the stronger personalities, so they're not dominating a session?
Yeah, that's a bit of a tightrope. Um, I think not saying no, keeping. I think it's really important. You got to keep leaning forward and trying to, keep the flow of ideas. Um, I would use the expression, let's put a pin in that for the moment. Let's put a pin in that idea. And that was my way of not saying no to an idea and not saying we're not going to discount it, but just saying we can re-examine that idea a little later or come back to it, you know. So I think it gets back, and I loved your analogy early on about the conductor, you know, that our job was to listen to everybody like a conductor and know, when to tell the second violin to play a little louder, or when to tell the cello player that, that those notes aren't quite right. But again, it's all within the context of the bigger experience of we were trying to do. So I think, I, a, that to me is that the hardest part of it was, you know, being able to manage big personalities and casting. Even earlier we were talking about, getting a variety of people into blue sky sessions. But I knew there were also certain people, and sometimes, and I hate to say it, you just have to avoid them because either the personalities were so big or you knew they had a reputation, and you just had to steer clear of them. And if for some reason you had to have them involved on some level, it just became a little more challenging in trying to manage them in the session, because in the end you don't want anybody to feel intimidated. And that's all. And I think that's what those bigger personalities in the room do. They create intimidation. And I never wanted anybody to feel intimidated. I think the best way to get the ideas to flow was to level the playing field. We're all in here with, we're all bring different backgrounds. We all bring, different experiences to this. And that's the value that's going to make what we're doing great. And if people realize that, if you were able to establish that earlier on, then you were going to have a successful session.
So great. I've had people ask before when they say, you talk about creating, this a level of comfort and for people to feel, secure and safe
Yeah.
in a blue sky session specifically, or creative development, anything like that. And why do you mention that? And I always tell them that creative is one of those disciplines no matter what industry or what
Mm.
project type you're working on, that comes with a level of risk, because you're starting with, as Marty used to say, right, the blank piece of paper. There's
Right.
nothing on it. So you're presenting something that you don't know if
Mhm.
it can be built. You don't know if it should be built. you're
Right.
you're throwing out this idea, and the risk associated with that is somebody's like, oh, that's a dumb idea, right?
Right.
If you're in a more technical or scientific based discipline, 1+1 is still two.
Right.
And there's not a lot of risk in saying that, not to detract from what anybody does, but those are much more quantitative,
Right.
science based disciplines. And I feel oftentimes as a creative, they often say you have to go way out on the limb to get the best fruit,
Right.
and that's not without risk, right?
Right. Yeah. 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 That's a really great point about, in a scientific discipline. Yeah. There's right and there's wrong. And it's very clear. This is right and that's wrong. And in a creative endeavor, you have to play in the gray. It's not black. And in fact, playing in the gray is where you start to really, the ideas really start to flow, when it's not this or that. It could be this, it could be that, it could be this thing in the middle. And that's that playing in the gray, which, I think, some of the executives, the non-creative types, they just didn't understand that. Um,
Yeah.
but I think by by establishing those design filters and by acknowledging the parameters that you're working it within, like we mentioned earlier about, understanding this is the budget, this is the site constraints, these are the operational constraints, then those executives would feel a little more at ease because they would know that, you're being responsible. That's the other thing. I think there's a misconception, that creativity is irresponsible. You know,
Right.
but in our industry, it's anything but. It has to be responsible. It has to be responsible to all those things we just talked about. And again, that becomes that tightrope of walking between all the responsible stuff and all the crazy creative stuff over here. But in the end, they all have to converge to create that final product. And by acknowledging both sides, the crazy and the practical, that's when you're going to get something great.
The crazy and the practical. It's so true. I was thinking as you were describing that, as I've been blessed with the opportunity to work in similar functions as you have, where you're leading whole organizations. Sometimes it's hundreds of people, and the burden of that responsibility, I think it weighs kind of heavy, because we care, right? You care about, even though this isn't a Disney vernacular, it was still it was still the same setup, right? My client, whether that was cruise line or Paris or whatever, as an Imagineer, that client may have a completely different need for the product or the experience that we're creating. And if you don't approach that right and balance it and deliver fundamentally on their brand and on their bottom line at the end of the day, it's going to fall flat and it's not going to work. So
Yeah.
you're constantly kind of balancing all of that.
Yeah, that's that tightrope.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I would love to move into just a little bit of a future focus, kind of looking ahead. I always love to spend time with my guests, kind of talking about the future of the industry. And, with the advent of AI and so many different AI tools, I'm wondering your opinion on how blue sky development, this, again, going from a blank sheet of paper, and what do you think the future of that is? Do you think the industry is kind of losing touch, or you
Well,
know what's the idea process today like, and what do you think it is for the future?
well, I don't have the crystal ball, and we know how quickly things are changing. I mean, just you and I were talking earlier before we were on camera here about AI and how it's affecting our work in a good way. Because we understand it's a tool. Um,
Right.
you just mentioned the blank sheet of paper, and that made me think of Marty Sklar. And I
Yeah.
remember Marty had this great quote about Walt. And he said, Walt had one foot in the past and one foot in the future.
That's great.
And the foot in the past was about understanding and acknowledging, the core of what made, you know, humans human, what made, stories everlasting, the happily ever after. And that was never going to change. That foot in the past was acknowledging that we are people. We're always going to love, cry, laugh, want to be with loved ones, all those things that make us human. And that's what stories do. Stories help define and reinforce the human experience. But then that foot in the future, he said, was about Walt, who was probably one of the most curious human beings, because he always wanted, what was the next great technology that's out there that I can use to tell those stories better. And I
Yeah.
think I think there's AI is now, that's at this moment right now. I remember when computer graphics came in, and people stopped drawing on paper and started drawing on tablets, and it didn't change. I mean, you were still in the service of the big idea and still in the service of trying to create a great guest experience. So I think if I can pass on to your listeners, anything, it's never lose sight of what the technology is there to service. Don't always remember that it's got to have a great story. It's got to be connected to the human experience, and then use that tool, whatever it is, to further that. And there may be another new something that comes up, but I think we'll always be human, and we'll always have those attributes that we'll want to see in a product, in an experience. And if ChatGPT can help tell the story better, great. If an AI, image generator can create that first initial look quicker and faster, great. But if they're servicing the story and the experience, then fantastic.
Absolutely. I really appreciate the description that you gave of what Marty said about Walt, a foot in the past, a foot in the future. And it so succinctly describes so many processes that we use. I think often of architects.
Yeah,
And I like you, I have many friends that are architects, and they're very fond of saying that the best new architects, in their opinion, are those that learn how to hand draft first and know how the benefit of those old tools. Not that you have to be a master at them, but just understand them so that you can really respect and appreciate, the CAD, the BIM 360s, the
right.
Revit, the Rhinos, so you can really, grasp it. And I think that mindset probably applies to a lot of creative disciplines as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, because ultimately you're giving these tools, these things, these machines, the prompts, and I think the more you understand, you know, the discipline of writing, the discipline of drawing. Like I look at portfolios of young people, and I still encourage them, just like the architects. I still encourage them, keep a sketchbook, learn how to sketch. You don't have to be a great draftsman, but you got to learn how to sketch, because that teaches you how to take an idea in your head and put it on, at least in the most basic form, on a piece of paper. you know Learn basic perspective, learn value, that how to use lights and darks, to bring things forward, to push things back, to help you understand how to orchestrate a scene, so that the things that you're trying to communicate are clearly where they need to be, because you understand those things. So when I look at a portfolio, I can tell when a student has some of those skills and when they don't, because then it's just a Frankenstein monster. You can go and you can photo bash, or you can use an AI
Right.
generator. you know but if you understand, how, because even as you're working with the AI generator and you're working with CGI or whatever, if you understand value and you understand, composition and those things, you're able to direct it, to create an end product that's going to, again, and it all comes down to communicating a clearer idea, an
Absolutely.
idea that has a hierarchy, that what's the important thing here, what's the secondary thing here. So yeah, just I'm with you. Learn the basic skills for you young students out there. You know, you don't have to be a great draftsman, you don't have to be a great writer, but learn the fundamentals, the basics, to guide you, to help you guide the machines.
Absolutely. You're in my head because as you were initially talking, I was thinking about students that I've met with and how they find, I have a coaching service, and I end up with a lot of students, but also pros that are in the industry that are trying to adapt to the new things that are going on and maybe pivoting. And the subject of portfolios comes up, and they're thinking, with all of this technology, I don't have like my teachers or my mentors, the older school folks, like me, like us, the old school, where we could show generation of sketches, we could
Yeah,
show those things. And they feel like they have a more difficult time expressing the process that they use. So everything that you said was right on the money. I was just going to ask you that, but that's so important now for them to do. This next generation is really tracking, how do you use those tools? Don't just show a great mid-journey image.
right.
How did you use that tool? How does it play
Yeah,
in the larger process? How do you work with others?
that's
You know?
I love that word, process. I love process. I think that's why a lot of these behind the scenes, the making of books are so cool, because people like seeing, and in most cases, you're seeing how it started with either a little rough sketch, or a piece of reference that they found somewhere, and then then how they develop that, how they work the sketch, how that become the set, how that end up on the screen, or in our case, how that first initial blue sky idea turned into a sketch, turned into a rendering, the rendering turned into a CAD drawing, and that turned into something that people walk through and enjoy. Process.
Yeah, I love it too. Two questions. The first one is, if you we're thinking about the next generation, or maybe the young professionals, say people who are just now in the industry. I would love it if you could just spend a couple seconds talking to them about your advice on ideation, right? Successful ideation, whether it's blue sky, whether it's the process of coming up, with a blank piece of paper and moving through that. Our industry is not getting simpler; it's getting more complex.
Yeah.
So, just love your thoughts and encouragement for them, people who are in it right now. What advice would you give them?
Oh, well, I mean, we've talked. I think we've given them a lot of advice through the course of our conversation today. So, at the risk of repeating myself, I think it be true to the human experience. You know, I think just like we were just talking about, you have all these amazing tools at your disposal. I think there's never been a time where you can get imagery, get words so quickly to help describe an idea. And that's good, but it can also be a handicap because I think ideation, allowing the process to think like we were talking about earlier about plussing idea, that I said there's always more, there's always a better idea, there's always a bigger idea. And allowing, being true to that don't be satisfied that this machine is giving you something and that's it. I don't have to do anything else unless it fulfills all your criteria. And that's the other thing, being true to yourself and really understanding, the criteria you're working against. What am I solving for? What am I trying to create here? What does my client want? All those things that we've been talking about today, Theron. If they're true to that and they're true to understanding that, in the end, it still has to be something that works for the human experience, both
Absolutely.
on the physical level and on the emotional level.
I think that's fantastic advice. Is don't lose sight of the fact that you're building this for humans. It's all about the experience and connecting emotionally. These guests, visitors, the people who will experience what it is that you're creating.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea is for them to build memories
Yeah.
so that they'll love it and come back over and over again. And that takes a really special level of focus. I'm so grateful you brought that up. Last question is going to be, we've talked, and I started the whole podcast by saying it's a bit special because here I'm sitting with another creative lead, and that's it. It took me 6 episodes to get there because my focus was on how do we connect interdisciplinary, and the idea of the podcast was to kind of demonstrate that. But what I would love if you could just spend a second and talk about, in your experience, and maybe this could be advice for other creatives, is how do you interface with all of these sometimes very, very differently focused other disciplines or other roles that are on a project? And if you just have some best practices on, it could be daunting for
Yeah.
a new professional out there. It's like, ride design and lighting and programming and what are some, you know, ideas, advice that you could give them?
I would say it's acknowledging their value, that it's what Carl Holtz was so good at doing, letting them know that what they bring to the process. And not feel, and there's always going to be somebody that you might be intimidated by, whether it's a stronger personality or somebody that's farther up the food chain. Uh, but always having confidence in yourself, believing that, I'm here because I've done something that people acknowledge that, so I'm bringing value to this too. But my value is in a certain realm, just like your value is in a certain realm, and
Right.
together our combined values are going to create something better than mine by itself or yours by itself. So,
Awesome perspective. I love that. You had said something earlier that describes what I love as well, as that is being curious, and just never um, being satisfied. I've figured it all out. This staying hungry, staying curious, and I remember in my career, all of a sudden, poof, you're an art director, and now you're responsible for making these decisions. This was at Disney MGM Studios. It's a story I've told before, and we were rehabbing an attraction, and there was a part of that work that I had never done before, and that was sort of like show programming.
Hmm.
And we were sitting in a meeting. I don't know if you've ever worked with Linda Alcorn before. Just amazing talent, engineer, and very pragmatic. And we were sitting in there, and she basically was saying, well, I need direction on this. And I was a little bit embarrassed because I'm like, I don't know. So after the meeting, I asked her, I said, I want to give you good, solid direction. And I know it's my responsibility to lead this, but I haven't done what you've done before. Can you teach me? Can I shadow you? Can we come back at night and you can take me through an attraction? And so I just wanted to encourage others that
Uh,
you can always ask, you can always learn, and if you've never worked with a particular discipline before, sit down and talk to that person, right? Figure it out.
that's great advice. Yeah, that's what I said a moment ago about not you can be intimidated. You can address that intimidation two ways. One, by being intimidated and pulling back or doing exactly what you did, and that's about being honest and open and saying, hey, you know what, I don't understand that, so sit and tell me. Or sometimes I would just say, you know what, it was so far beyond my understanding, and mostly a lot of the engineering stuff. I would just tell them, just be brilliant, do what you do so well.
You don't need me, just be
Yeah,
brilliant.
yeah.
That's awesome. Well, Joe, thanks so much. This has been amazing. I not only appreciate your time, but bringing your brilliance and perspective for the audience. I think it's amazing. Would you, if anybody wants to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
You can go to, well, I have a website. It's lanciserocreative.com. And then you can reach me at joe@lanciserocreative.com. Or I'm on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Facebook. I'm not that big on the socials. Probably more on LinkedIn because I mean, that's an industry. It's for us.
Yeah.
It's lanciserocreative.com, joe@lanciserocreative.com. And I'd love to hear from you. And I try to get out there. I love doing what we did today. I'm at that point in my life and in my career where it's great to give back. It's so nice to sit with like-minded people like yourself there. That we've been in the trenches together. We've experienced these things, and it's great that we can. We're now at a point in our lives that I want to be able to give some of it back. So yeah, I'm open. Send me an email if you want to chat, or I love that you're doing formal mentoring. That's great. I do a lot of talks at schools and such. Like I said earlier, I'm very involved in this UX community as well. So I'm happy to reach out. I'm happy to respond if you reach out to me.
Amazing. I know you do quite a lot. You post quite a lot of art on LinkedIn, so I'm always enjoy. You, I know you do a lot of travel and things. So for those that don't follow Joe on LinkedIn, if you really want to go and look at some awesome posts and for holidays and events and seasonal things and just his travel, you can see some really great art that's out there. And
Thank
you want to talk a little bit about your book as well?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I get the plug in for
Please.
both Theron and I are very proud and happy grandparents. And so
Yes.
this book grew out of being a grandparent. This is Lemonade the Yellow Bear. And I wrote this for my grandkids, and it's about just the joys of childhood. It's this little yellow bear who loves everything yellow, and he sees all the wonder in the world. So it's easy for kids to do that. Us, I think we as adults, we often lose fact of the sight that there's magic everywhere. But the little yellow bear sees it, and I tried to have fun with that. And so, yeah, you can get it on Amazon. Lemonade the Yellow Bear. Great for the kids. Thank
Awesome.
you so much.
Thanks. Oh yeah, thanks for sharing it. I love that. It's fantastic. Well, thanks for joining me today, making such a special episode. And for my audience out there, just remember that you can do anything that you put your mind to. And I hope that Joe and I's conversation, plus the other 5 episodes, gives you this idea of how you can interface with anyone. And remember that your superpower is listening. And
Yeah.
that's not waiting so that you can have a chance to speak. That listening is what gives us the ability to do amazing things. So thanks, and I'll see you on episode 7.
Wow. Thank you.